12. So firstly, thanks for everyone for joining us. Welcome to the joint webinar between NEC and the Pipeline Industries Guild in relation to how NEC4 can support collaborative contracting in the oil and gas industry. My name's John Richardson. I work for SGA Innovation Department, and I'm also the current chair of the Scottish branch of the Pipeline Industries Guild. So just the housekeeping first. So if anyone's got any questions, please, the presenters will present, but if there's any questions, put them into the chat function. We'll get on to the Q&A session at the end. We've got an hour and a half today, but we've got a lot of good information to go through. If there's any questions that aren't answered, if we've not got time to do it, I think we've got a bit of a hard stop at 1:30. We will record a transcript of the questions that have been put into the chat function, and we'll get back to you within around a week, depending on the number of questions, of course. So just a quick introduction. So this is the Scottish branch, our second webinar this year. We held our last webinar in September, which was successful. This webinar has came about because I think it was Sean Kennelly, who's one of the contributors. We're always chatting around NEC and the use of NEC within the oil and gas industry. We then hooked up with Ian Heaphy and Peter Cousins, who are also contributors to the webinar, and will be involved in the presentations. And we thought it would be a good opportunity for us to do a bit of stakeholder engagement, one from the NEC's perspective and one from the Pipeline Industries Guild. And obviously ask the question, you know, why is it is getting used in the oil and gas industry, but how can we actually make sure it gets utilised more? And obviously, is there any barriers in there, which we'll cover in the subsequent slides. The meeting will be getting recorded as well, so if there's any objections, you don't need to jump off, unfortunately, and it will be available on the social media platforms and YouTube and the likes, and we can send out links to the recording as well if you want to share with any of your colleagues. So on to the contributors. So Ian Heaphy is from the NEC4 Contract Board. Ian will be taking the main presentation slot today. He'll be supported by Peter Cousins and also by Sean Kennelly. Now, when we spoke earlier, we asked the question, why are we having this discussion today in this webinar? There have been a lot of discussions over the years between myself and Sean, and more recently with Ian and Peter, about firstly, what are the potential barriers that people seem to think are there when we talk about use of NEC4 in the oil and gas industry. And at the Pipeline Industry Guild, we've done some stakeholder engagement with some of our members, and we asked them what are the main barriers. You know, a lot of our members are avid users of the NEC Suite of Contracts and have been for a number of years. There is some users within the oil and gas industry, but some of the feedback that we got was in relation to risk management and mitigation of risk, contractual risk. And some of the barriers that we can see here, the first one being the industry's use of mutual indemnities. And those are used in the effective allocation of the risk of a particular type of loss between two parties, and ensures that neither of them should have sole responsibility for that particular species of loss. And an example is what will happen if a third party property is damaged or if a third party personnel is injured or killed. The other main bit of feedback that we got was the IMHH, which is the Industry Mutual Hold Harm Scheme. And this is probably the most utilised tool for contractual indemnification in the UK continental shelf. It establishes a contractual risk management framework between different companies working together in the UKCS. And the basis of this scheme is that in the event of any accident or damage to property, accident or death to personnel, each company will be responsible for its own personnel, property and consequential loss arising. Now, this is in contrast with the common law approach, where liability should be accepted by the party, in the industry, the thought is that liability should be accepted by the party in the best position to ensure or potentially absorb any potential loss. Another key bit of feedback that we got was NEC's use of consequential loss and the exclusion of consequential loss, particularly around the definition. So for those who don't know, exclusion of consequential losses or damages is standard in modern day businesses, as the risk involved in accepting such risk of associated damages is too great and insurance cover for such types of loss is not available at a reasonable price. One of the main potential barriers that we've seen when we were talking to some of our members was the definition. And in English law, the word consequential has come to mean not directly. And there's a lot of case law associated with this. I think the biggest risk when talking about consequential loss is when it does become a standard clause, and sometimes parties will fail to adequately consider what type of loss you would like to be covered under that, and how the word consequential loss is interpreted, certainly in my experience under English law. Now, some of the other feedback that we've had was in and around the limit of liability, understanding of risk under NEC4, and also probably the main one for me in my time within the oil and gas industry and other sectors is any form of change can be difficult, and it comes around to people being comfortable, or we've always done it this way, so why should we change? But I think there is a definite opportunity for us to utilise NEC4 more widely within the industry. And what I'll do now is I will pass on to Ian, who will take us through his slide pack and will hopefully tackle some of these potential barriers or deemed potential barriers. So thanks, and Ian, over to you if you can take control.
Okay, thank you, John. Hopefully my slides are up on screen and people can see those. So just sharing those for you all. Oh, sorry, just go back to that. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so thank you for that, John. So my name's Ian Heaphy. So just by way of a very brief introduction, I'm a member of the NEC4 Contract Board. So I've been involved in developing the 4th edition of the NEC contracts. My background is in construction primarily, but I have worked in the oil and gas sector in the UK, Canada, in Houston, and also out in Sakhalin Island in Russia. So hopefully I can bring some knowledge of the oil and gas industry into the presentation, which will go through how we believe the NEC4 contracts can successfully support the delivery of projects of new construction within the oil and gas sector, including the process plant, upstream, downstream activities. But maybe we can talk a little bit about its application when we look more into the individual contracts. So for my slot, the agenda is a bit of background to the NEC4. Not going to bore you with a history lesson, but just give you some key facts. Then look at the NEC contracts, how they fit together, how they're structured. We'll then look at flexibility and risk allocation. So that's already been highlighted by John around concerns around liabilities and risks and how they are dealt with. We can talk around that. And then look at some of the key provisions within the contract that will deal with collaboration and that can hopefully encourage parties to work together to deliver better results. And then finally, we'll try and leave some time at the end for questions. So as has already been mentioned, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat function or just simply give your name and say you'd like to ask a question. And then we can come back to you at the end to engage in some discussion and some debate. So a little bit of background to the NEC forms of contract. Really, the key thing I want to highlight here is these contracts have been around for over 25 years. The first edition was published way back in 1993. That actually followed a pre-publication version being used in the industry. So we have quite an extensive track record of the use of these forms of contracts, and they're used not just in the UK, they're also used on an international basis. They are heavily used in Hong Kong. They've been used in South Africa for many years. They're being used in New Zealand. They're also now being much more widely adopted in Australia. And we've seen places like the Netherlands, also Belgium, where these contracts have been used. So quite a wide spread of use, different countries, different jurisdictions, different governing laws, where successful use of the NEC has occurred. It's also been used not just in terms of the construction industry, but it has been used in the oil and gas industry, pharmaceutical, process plant type industries as well. And just giving a few examples of some of those. Example on the screen there where it's been used in South Africa. That was for an oil and gas project. So Sasol used these contracts extensively for the work that they undertake. And they were using a couple of the contracts within the NEC suite. It's also used heavily in the nuclear industry as part of the new build program, but also as part of the decommissioning program that's being done by people like Magnox. We see it being used for wind farms. Example on the screen of it being used for a wind farm over in Australia, how it's been selected for use there. It's increasingly being used in that part of the world. So not just for oil and gas, but for wind energy, these contracts are being used successfully. Example here now of where it's being used in mainland Europe. It's being used by a division of the Antwerp government called Lantis, who are responsible for a €3.5 billion project, completing the ring road around Antwerp. And then maybe a bit closer to home as an example, Thames Tideway, the super sewer being built under London, circa 2 billion sterling of construction. And that is being delivered using ECC Option C main contracts, and that is ongoing while we speak. So just a little bit of background, a little bit of history around its use, really trying to demonstrate it has been used extensively over the last 25 years plus. It's endorsed for use by the UK government and also by the government of Hong Kong, and it's designed to be used across any type of work anywhere in the world. So looking at sort of the background to the contracts and what the contracts are trying to achieve, how they've been developed. They've been developed with three key principles at their heart, and these are flexibility, clarity, and stimulus to good management. And these have been present in every edition of the contract produced, and these are absolutely central to how the contracts are developed, how they are arranged, how they are updated. And I'll just touch a little bit more on how these work and how these are sort of brought to life in the contracts in the next couple of slides. So flexibility. The contracts are designed to be used for any type of work anywhere in the world. So they're not designed to be used under a particular type of law. They are to be used under common law, or they can be used under civil law, depending on the location. They're designed to be used for any type of construction work, including heavy industries, oil and gas, etc. There's no limitation around that. We have the ability to allocate design responsibility between the parties. So we can have an entirely sort of turnkey approach, or we can have entirely client designed. So a mixture of options available, and I'll talk more about that when we look at some of the detail of the contracts. We also have a modular format to the contracts, where we have a series of main and secondary options available for selection. And these deal with things like allocation of risk, deal with things like limitations of liability, amongst others. And it's all a way of trying to give the client, or if a contractor is using the forms to engage subcontractors or suppliers, flexibility to choose options that match their procurement strategy, that match their appetite for risk. And this can be achieved by selecting options readily available that don't need to be amended or altered, meaning you've got an incredibly flexible contract or ready to use without having to go through a process of amendment, engaging experts to change things or reword things. you hopefully have all of the options you require within the modular options in the contract. The next key theme we have in the contracts is clarity and clarity and simplicity. So the contracts are written in ordinary language. The idea being these are contracts that people are going to use day to day. These are not contracts written by sort of legal professionals or contract experts that are signed up, put in a drawer, and only reviewed by other learned experts if a problem develops, if there's an issue later. These are contracts designed to be used day to day by the people actually involved in delivering the asset, who are building the refinery or whatever it is. Those people need to be able to read and understand the contract, so we keep it simple. We use plain English, there's no legal phrases, there's no cross-referencing. We keep the clauses as short as possible, using bullet points where we can to ease understanding, to make people who are not necessarily contract experts able to pick them up, understand them, and to work through them. We also try to minimize the use of subjective phrases such as fair and reasonable. We try to create, wherever possible, objective reasons as to why decisions are made. This is to try to avoid any arguments or disagreements you may find where you have these types of subjective terms. So we try to give a very clear structure. If you like, the contract forms a set of rules, and it is a very clear set of rules over who has to do what, when they have to do it by, setting out timescales, and therefore we have clarity over who has to do what and when. And if people fail to do that, we can then deal with the consequences. And I'll give some examples of that when we look more into the mechanics of the contracts themselves. The final thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the general principles is stimulus to good management. And this is the most important objective. This is really what the contract is all about. It's about trying to create a set of rules that not only provide a set of sort of legal liabilities and responsibilities between the parties, but also sets out a series of management processes, identifying who has to do what and when, so that decisions can be made in a timely fashion. The contract is all about requiring the parties to make decisions, to reach agreements, to move forward, and not to spend time agreeing to disagree or parking issues that will be dealt with later in some sort of big final account negotiation. This contract is all about processes and procedures to get things agreed as and when they occur. So it's all about encouraging the parties or requiring the parties to work together effectively to get these decisions made. The contract is founded on the principles of foresight, applied collaboratively, will mitigate problems and shrink risk. And we have provisions like early warnings, program issue and acceptance that plays to this sort of agenda, requiring people to try to, at the earliest stage, identify potential problems, potential risks, for those to be put on the table and dealt with, hopefully in advance of them occurring, rather than a party possibly trying to take advantage of the situation, maybe keeping quiet in the hope that they can then use the situation to their advantage later. We encourage, we require people to identify problems at the earliest stage so they can be mitigated. And also, we clearly try to division the functionality and responsibility between the parties, who has to do what and when, to make it clear what is required. And by identifying what people have to do, when they have to do it by, it's much more likely to happen. And if it doesn't, we can then deal with the consequences. And the idea behind this good management, this effective management, is going to lead to the client being placed in charge of the change control process. So rather than maybe on more traditional forms, a problem occurs, the contractor resolves it, then retrospectively seeks recovery from the client for maybe a solution that is not what the client would have wanted or would have done. We try to avoid that. by raising issues early, addressing them early, the client is in the driving seat when it comes to deciding how to deal with issues that may lead to increased costs or delay to the contract. Identifying these problems early means we can mitigate them, and we're trying to get into a situation where, as we agree issues as and when they occur, a final account for the contract can be agreed within weeks of the job finishing rather than months or years. And we do genuinely see that happen in practice. We see final accounts being agreed very quickly after a job is complete, and we see a real reduction in claims and disputes as a result. You know, by way of example, NEC contracts have been used in Hong Kong now for over 10 years. Hong Kong has had a history of a lot of claims and disputes in its locality. So far, there's not been any formal disputes on NEC contracts within that territory to date. The processes are leading, it seems, to the reduction in that potential and much better outcomes for clients. And we see that elsewhere in the world as well. Just touching then on the NEC Suite of Contracts. NEC is a brand name for a suite of contracts. Some people still refer to NEC as the new engineering contract. That title did disappear some time ago. It's not new. It's been around for 25 years plus. And now we use the abbreviation NEC as the brand name for a suite of contracts that is continually evolving and expanding to try to allow all of the key players in the supply chain involved in creating assets, maintaining assets, to be engaged on similar contracts containing the same good practice principles, creating a framework of contracts that can interrelate and contain similar provisions to enable all of the key members of the supply chain to be engaged on a similar basis. At the top of the, well, on the screen in front of you, you see the slide. Along the horizontal axis, we have the life of an asset through from business case, design, into implementation and operation. And on the vertical axis, we have at the top higher complexity contracts, and then in the bottom half of the diagram, lower complexity projects. And so within that, we have the NEC contracts, starting with the PSC, the professional services contract. That is a contract designed to engage a professional to provide a service, exactly as the name suggests. And that can be any professional service. It could be design, it could be project management, commercial management, it could be engaging professionals to undertake business case development, or possibly to provide a operational facilities management function. Any professional service can be engaged under the PSC. And we have the PSS, the professional services subcontract, which can be used by a consultant to engage subconsultants, or it could be used by a contractor to engage a professional consultant, maybe in a design and build arrangement. So flexible to be used at different points in the supply chain. We then have the ECC, if you like, that's the main contract within the suite, and that is the engineering and construction contract. It is the contract used by a client to engage a main contractor to undertake construction or engineering works. We then have the ECS, which is the engineering and construction subcontract, a contract which that main contractor can use to engage subcontractors to undertake construction and engineering works. The SC is the supply contract, and that is a contract for supply only, but that could be for buying vessels, pieces of kit, reactors, whatever it may be. Those pieces of kit, equipment can be bought under the supply contract and then delivered to a delivery point for installation into the plant that is being constructed. And that contract can be used by a client if they're directly procuring materials on a free issue basis, or it could be used by a contractor to engage with their supply chain. We then have the TSC, the term service contract, and that is a contract designed to engage a contractor to undertake maintenance or facilities management functions for an asset for a number of years, for a service period. So that can be used for any type of FM services. It can be reactive maintenance, planned maintenance, anything of that nature. And then we have the TSS, which is the subcontract version of that contract, to be used by a contractor to engage their supply chain. We then have the ALC, which I'll actually talk about a little bit more shortly, but that is the alliance contract used to engage multiple suppliers, consultants, along with the client in a single contract to work as a collaborative alliance, sharing risk, sharing responsibilities to deliver clients' objectives. We then have the DBO, which is a designed, build and operate contract that links together the provision of a service to maintain or operate an asset with the creation of that asset or major refurbishment of assets. So it's a service-based contract to provide a service for a fixed period of time, but within that service period, there is the creation of a new asset or major refurbishment of existing assets. And then sort of below the line, halfway down, we get the short forms of the above contracts. So we have a professional services short contract. We have an engineering and construction short contract, an engineering and construction short subcontract. And these, as the name would suggest, are shortened, abridged versions of the main contracts designed to be used where we have contracts that require less management provisions, so that are more have lower risk, have lower complexity, and therefore we need simpler contracts with reduced management and administration requirements. We have a short supply contract and a term service short contract. And then just to close out the slide, the FC at the bottom is the framework contract that is used to create a call-off arrangement under which a client can engage a contractor or consultant on a term basis, and they can then call off services or works or supply using any of the contracts in the NEC suite under that framework agreement. And then finally, the DRSC is the dispute resolution service contract, and that is a contract to engage a dispute resolver who will be engaged to resolve any disagreements between the parties who are engaged under any of the other contracts in the NEC suite. So, hopefully there's a good spread of contracts dealing with all the life cycle stages of an asset, allowing all the key members of the supply chain to be engaged under these same types of contracts with the same good practice benefits. Just looking at how you could use those contracts in an oil and gas setting, sort of petrochem or process plant. If you're going to go down the route of having front-end engineering design, wanting to engage a consultant or possibly a contractor to do some initial design whilst you're establishing whether the scheme is viable, you could use the professional services contract to engage someone to undertake that feed stage of development. When you move into construction, and whether that's build only, whether it's design and build, or even an EPC turnkey type arrangement, you could use the ECC. The engineering and construction contract allows any allocation of design responsibility. So, as I say, could be entirely client designed, could be all contractor designed. That contract can be used in both situations. If you just want a consultancy service, engage a commercial team, engage a project management team, again, the PSC can be used for that. If you have a refinery, a process plant that's already in existence, needs to be maintained, possibly with some upgrades occurring, some improvements, you can use the term service contract. That allows you to maintain the existing state of an asset and also call off some betterment using task orders that are present under that contract to maybe do some extensions, some alterations, in addition to the usual routine maintenance. We also have, under the ECC, a secondary option, X22. And X22 allows for early contractor involvement. It in effect creates a two-stage contract. In reality, it's a contract with a breakpoint at the end of the first stage. So you could engage a contractor quite early on in the development of a project. They undertake some design. They provide advice on buildability, logistics, planning, how the works will go ahead. That's paid for on a cost reimbursable basis. And then once we get to a stage where we have sufficient information, we know the scheme's viable, that we wish to proceed to the actual construction, we would then have a go, no-go point where we either agree to move into stage 2 and deliver the project, or we can bring the contract to an end at the end of stage 1 and both parties simply walk away. So creating that ability to have this two-stage arrangement with a break point, allowing the contractor to get involved early, provide that early advice and support to the client, work with the client to develop the price, the program for the main construction phase, and then if everything's agreed, moving into that stage, or if not, calling the contract to a halt at the end of stage 1. And they're just some quite simple examples. Obviously, there's lots of more complicated arrangements you could look at, depending on how you want to use the contracts, the nature of the work you were involved in procuring or delivering. Just touching on the Alliance contract, I'm not going to spend too long on this because we have limited time. This could be a topic for another discussion at some stage later. But the Alliance contract was published for the first time by the NEC in June 2018. So it's fairly new and I think fairly innovative. So it's designed for where we have major projects or possibly a series of schemes that are rolled together to form a major program of work. And this allows the creation of a true alliance, if you like. And what we mean by that is it's a single contract that is signed by the client and maybe a number of contractors, consultants, suppliers, who are all then bound by the same contract. They share the majority of risk and the majority of reward. So they are very much working as a team, sharing in each other's performance, working together, trying to help each other deliver and achieve, because they either all win together or they can all lose together. So truly creating this collaborative arrangement, all about trying to find the best person to do the job, allocating work on a best for person basis, and we have no claims and no blame. So the contract doesn't allow the parties, or with very limited exceptions, allow the parties to have disputes between themselves. They are agreeing to work on a truly collaborative arrangement. And this is a contract that I know is being looked at by clients in the oil and gas sector. Similar approaches have been adopted historically in the North Sea, in Australia, and this is an option now to use an NEC contract to create that type of truly collaborative arrangement. What I'm now going to do is turn to the ECC, the Engineering and Construction Contract, just to use this as an example of the nature of the NEC contracts generally. What we do as the NEC is when we create the contracts, we try to keep them as consistent as possible. So we try to use the same clauses, the same main options, the same secondary options in all of the contracts we produce. The idea that consistency allows people to get familiar with them, that if you understand one of the contracts in the NEC suite, you understand a large part of all of the others, because of this drive for consistency and repetition across the contracts. Why change things if we don't need to and they work effectively? So by talking about the ECC as the example, the engineering and construction contract, that should give you a feel and a flavour for all of the contracts within the NEC suite. So the first thing to highlight in terms of this modular approach I mentioned earlier is we firstly have a choice of main options. So a client, when looking to engage a contractor, has to select from one of these options, and this will largely govern how the commercial risk of the contractor's performance is allocated between the parties. And if a contractor was engaging a subcontractor, they would have the same choice, or at least the choices of options A, B, C, D, and E in relation to any subcontracts they engaged. So again, allowing that flow down of options between main contracts and subcontracts. And I'm just going to sort of jump ahead to this slide to sort of show how these different options work and how they fit together, and what it means to select one main option over another. So you've got on the screen there a diagram showing increasing risk and reward potential to the contractor on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, increasing risk reward to the contractor in terms of the contractor's increase in risk and reward on the vertical. On the horizontal, the client's risk and reward. And then we have the main options overlaying that. And then if we look at flexibility for the client and speed to site, you can start to see how these different options fit together. So at the top left-hand side of the diagram, option A. Option A is a priced contract with an activity schedule. So it is a fixed price lump sum contract. So under that option, once the contract's been awarded, the contractor is carrying the greater financial risk and reward potential. If they win the job with a bid of $10 million, then the contractor will be paid that $10 million subject to any changes, what we in NEC refer to as compensation events. So the contractor wins the job at 10 million, that's what they will be paid. If they deliver it for a lower price, if they make savings, the contractor will get the benefit of all the savings they create. Conversely, if they overspend, if the price is insufficient, they have problems, the contractor will carry the risk of that overspend. So the contractor's taking the greater financial risk and reward potential. It gives the client comfort around they have a better understanding of what price they're going to pay, what it will be, subject to any changes, any compensation events. In order to use option A, you need to have a certainty of scope. The client needs to have a clear scope of what they want the contractor to achieve. That doesn't mean it has to be fully designed. Option A works well with design and build situations, but there must be a clear performance output to be achieved, identified within the scope. So you need the certainty of scope. Contractor can then commit to a fixed price against it. They then take the risk and reward potential of delivering the project for that price. The way payments are made under option A, excuse me, is that we pay based on activities. So the contractor will produce an activity schedule, breaking down what they're going to do into a series of activities representing their methodology, and payment will be made to the contractor on the basis of completed activities. So it operates in some ways like a milestone payment schedule, with the payment milestone being the end of the activity. Option B is a more traditional measure and value contract. So under option B, the client will produce a bill of quantities identifying the type of work to be undertaken, produced in accordance with a stated method of measurement. And then as the contractor undertakes the work, we will remeasure the quantities of work actually undertaken. So under this option, we are remeasuring based on the bill of quantities, so operating a bit like a schedule of rates, where the more of the item, the more of the quantity the contractor undertakes, the more they will get paid. The less they undertake, the lower the amount they will be paid. So under option B, the client is taking the risk and reward potential over the quantities. If the quantities go up, the price goes up. If the quantities come down, the price comes down. The contractor takes the risk of the rates and prices they've tendered being sufficient in order to allow the contractor to recover the costs of undertaking the work. So option B, remeasurement contract, not one of the more commonly used options in the UK certainly, but is a good one to use where you know the type of work to be done, but perhaps not the extent of it. Options C and D are target cost contracts. So these contracts involve the creation of a target. So a target is set at the start. That target will move based on compensation events, so changes. Under option D, the target contract will also move based on remeasurement of the quantities of work undertaken. But the target cost is basically set. It will move up or down with these changes. But then in some ways we put that target to one side as construction takes place, and we pay the contractor for the work they do on a cost reimbursable basis. So they are paid what in NEC terminology we call defined cost plus a pre-agreed fee percentage. So a cost plus arrangement. We pay the contractor what they actually expend, and then at completion, we compare what the contractor has actually spent to the target to work out whether there has been a saving created or a pain incurred. Okay, and maybe just jumping to this slide that shows how that works, where if a saving's been created, that saving is shared between the parties on a predetermined percentage split, very commonly a 50-50 share. Every pound saved, the contractor gets half of it, the client gets the benefit of half of it. Whereas on the right-hand side of the diagram, where we have an overspend situation, where the cost the contractor has incurred is greater than the target, we have a pain share, as it's commonly referred to, and that pain is shared between the parties, again, on a pre-agreed percentage split. So coming back to that slide, giving the overall allocation of risk between the main options, in options C and D, target is maybe set at a $10 million. At the completion, we compare that $10 million subject to any changes to what the contractor has actually spent. If they've only spent $8 million in providing the works, $2 million saving created on a 50-50 split, we would pay the contractor $9 million. The client would get the benefit of $1 million of savings. Conversely, we have an overspend. Target's $10 million, contractor spends $12 million. There's a $2 million overspend. That overspend will be shared between the parties. If it's a 50-50 share, the client would pay the contractor $11 million. The contractor would suffer a loss of $1 million. So very much aligning the parties' objectives to want to work together, encouraging the client to want to help the contractor save money and vice versa, in that if we can work together to reduce the cost of construction, that leads to savings that we all benefit in. So it's a great way of encouraging collaboration, cooperation between the parties. Also, because we have the visibility of the contractor's costs, we're paying on this cost reimbursable basis. It generates further trust between the parties. when we come to evaluate the cost of compensation events, it's often easier because we know what the contractor is actually incurring, what their real cost base is. We know where they're making money, where they're losing money, and it makes it an easier process to agree those changes. So option C, option D are commonly selected where maybe there's a higher risk in the delivery of the project and a potential for a greater level of post-contract changes than options A and B. We then have option F and option E, and these are both quite similar financially. In both option E and option F, we pay the contractor on a cost plus basis. So under these options, the client is taking the majority of the financial risk. If the budget is 10 million, but the contractor builds it for 8 million, they only get paid the 8 million plus their fee. Conversely, the budget's 10 million, but it costs 12 million to construct. The contractor is paid the 12 million plus their fee. The client is taking the greater commercial risk. The contractor is taking very little. And so in both of these options, you tend to use them maybe where you don't have a certainty of scope. Maybe it's emergency works, or maybe the client wants complete flexibility to change their scope, to change the nature of the work once the contract has been awarded. Option E and option F will accommodate that. Option E and F, the key difference there really is that option F is designed to be used where the contractor will undertake very little work themselves. The vast majority of the work will be subcontracted, and therefore you're really engaging the contractor to manage the work of others. Whereas under option E, the contractor may do some work themselves, as well as then subcontracting some elements out. Okay. So the next few slides I've spoken about, you'll have those as a copy to take away, just covering option A, which is one of the most commonly used options. Option C, I'd say, is actually the most commonly used option in my experience on an international basis. Option E is sometimes used where we have this lack of certainty over the scope, over what the client may want the contractor to do. Okay, I'm now going to just look briefly at the secondary options. These are given a letter X at their start, and there's a lot of these. I'm not going to go through them all. Some of them are fairly self-evident as to what they mean by looking at the title on the slide. We can always take questions at the end if there's any of these you're particularly interested in, or you can get information from NEC that gives some further background to these secondary options. I'm just going to pick out some of the more important ones from an oil and gas perspective, and just really highlighting how they can be used to deliver some of the issues or to meet some of the challenges the industry faces. So looking at secondary options X6 and X7 first. X6 is a bonus for early completion. X7 is delay damages. And so these are ways of trying to incentivize the contractor to finish on time or possibly earlier than the required completion date. So X6 is a positive incentive where a bonus is paid, whereas X7 is a negative incentive where the contractor would pay damages if they finish late. So different ways of encouraging performance, a positive and a negative. The client could select both of these or one of these, and they can link it to X5, sectional completion, which allows you to require the works to be completed and taken over by the client in sections. And you could link bonuses or delay damages to those sections, as well as to the whole of the works. Further secondary options to note, X9, transfer of rights. If this is selected, the client will own the contractor's intellectual property rights over any design they produce under the contract. So this is a decision for the client. Who do they wish to own that intellectual copyright of any design that is done specifically for the particular contract? That allocation, that ownership is determined by selection of this option. X10, information modeling. You may know that better as BIM, building information modeling. X10 deals with the contractual aspects of BIM. So it doesn't tell you who's producing what information to what level of detail. This deals with the contractual aspects of BIM around ownership of the information model, liability for clashes or errors in the model, liability and ownership of information within the model and the model itself. X12 deals with multi-party collaboration. So X12 is designed to be used where a client wishes to incentivize performance across different contracts. So trying to encourage different suppliers, contractors, consultants to want to work together to achieve a shared set of key performance indicators. So it allows the creation of a core team drawn from those suppliers who have X12 in their contracts. They come together, they help each other, they work to achieve a common set of objectives and deliver against these key performance indicators for the benefit of the client. If they achieve or better the targets, they will be rewarded with a bonus as a result. Touching on a couple of other issues around the secondary options, X17 low performance damages is one that can be used within process plants, petrochemical, pharmaceutical, particularly where you have an output that the completed plant has to achieve. So maybe it's got to, produce so much refined material at a certain flow or certain throughput. That can be specified. That's what the contractor has to achieve as a performance target. If the works, once built, commissioned and put into operation, fails to achieve the targets, then that can lead to a reduced payment by the client. In effect, a sliding scale of damages is pre-agreed that the contractor will have to pay if the asset they create does not achieve the performance targets stated. X18, I think, is an important one, coming back to what was discussed earlier and some of the concerns that John was raising from an oil and gas perspective. How do we deal with consequential loss? How do we deal with the contractor's liability? X18 brings in the option for the client to limit the contractor's liability for various different things, damage to existing property, but also an overall limitation of loss, a maximum amount that the contractor would be exposed to under the contract. So flexible over its selection, and then flexible over what types of liability are limited and as to what the value of that limitation will be. And then X22, early contractor involvement, I've already spoken about, creating that sort of two-stage process, allowing early engagement of a contractor, possibly under a feed type arrangement, to then move into a construction phase if the scheme is viable, if both the client and the contractor want to proceed to the second stage. In terms of different countries, different jurisdictions, we do recognise that whilst the contract is designed to be used anywhere in the world under any governing law, there are certain laws in certain countries that do impact upon construction contracts or engineering contracts. And so we have got a series of regional specific options that can be selected to deal with specific requirements of local law. And we have these for the United Kingdom and for New Zealand. There are some for the Republic of Ireland that are in production to be released very shortly. And similarly, we have some for Australia, which vary by state, which will be released in the new year. So we try to sort of head off the need for amendments to the existing core clauses where they conflict with specific requirements of local law by the introduction of these regional specific secondary options. In terms of flexibility, one of the reasons why we think NEC contracts can bring benefit is we have a number of options within the contracts to look at how we allocate risk between the parties, how we determine who is liable for what situations, for what risks. So, as I've discussed, we have a choice of contracts. You could have an alliance contract where the majority of risk and reward is shared between the parties. You can pick an ECC where we have a more traditional bi-party arrangement, risk allocated to one party or the other. But then we still have further options to look at risk allocation in terms of main option. Is it a fixed price lump sum? Is it a target cost? Is it cost reimbursable? Secondary options. Are we going to have, limitations on the contractor's liability? Are we going to have bonuses for early completion or delay damages? These options are available for selection. A client can choose some of them, all of them, or none of them. We then have the contract data, which is where we capture the contract specific information, who the client is, the starting date, the completion date, who is the contractor. So, what may be called an appendix in a more traditional form of contract, it's where we capture the contract specific information. And this also allows further tailoring of risk between the parties. So you can introduce as a client, if you wish, additional compensation events. So you can take on further risk as the client if you believe that will lead to maybe reduced prices, maybe encourage more bidders to get involved. You can also, as a client, take on additional liabilities, additional insurable risk, and take that from the contractor to be borne by the client. It may well be a client has deeper financial pockets. They are able to carry a greater proportion of risk to third parties. Therefore, they may choose to take on additional clients' liabilities within the contract data specific to that particular contract. We also have the ability to change the allocation for responsibility for providing insurances. So that would allow a client to provide insurances rather than the contractor. So it may be that a client feels they are better able to provide insurance for the works or insurance for plant and materials for incorporation into the works. Maybe they can do that at a program level. And so they can choose to be responsible for providing that insurance rather than the contractor. I've spoke about X18 already, limitation of liability. The level and types of liability can be changed in the contract data if X18 is selected to apply. And then finally, we have Z clauses, which allows the client to further tailor the contract if they feel the need to do so. So they can actually further amend it beyond the main and secondary options if they feel it necessary. Okay, I'm just going to very briefly touch on upon a few of the operational clauses within the contract, just to give you a feel for some of these, though this is really something we can talk about maybe in a further session. So first thing to highlight is at the very start of the contract, the second clause into the contract, clause 10.2, requires the parties, the project manager and the supervisor to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. So right at the start of the contract, and this clause is present in every NEC contract, we require the parties to operate in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Now, they're just words on a page. You may, some people may sort of scoff and say, well, you can say that, but does that really happen in practice? But actually, we see these clauses being used effectively, being used to make people behave in the right manner, to help each other rather than try and hinder each other. And there are a number of further provisions in the contract that bring this clause to life, require cooperation, collaboration between the parties. So this is really setting out an obligation at the very start of how we expect the parties to work together, the contract administrator, that's the project manager under the ECC, and how they are going to work together when they deliver the contract. In terms of time, it's the old maxim, time is money. The drafters of the NEC believe in that principle and believe that by having regularly updated programs produced by the contractor, submitted and accepted by the project manager, we're going to have much more likelihood of the job being delivered successfully. In that if we have an up-to-date program that is continually being rebaselined, so forming an accurate as-built record and allowing us to reforecast and determine what needs to happen going forward to allow the contractor to provide the works. If we have this up-to-date program, people will know what they have to do and when they have to do it by. That means that it's more likely to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we can then deal with the consequences. We can assess the impact, the delay, and we can do that on a progressive basis, proactively anticipating the problems, trying to envisage pinch points in the program, any issues about when someone can or can't deliver or meet the timescale. It forewarns us, it forearms us, and allows us to assess the impact of any compensation events, any contractor delays as and when they occur, rather than having to do all of this retrospectively, very much proactively anticipating what has to happen, who's got to do what and by when. We also have in the contract an early warning process, something that actually I think is a form of flattery we see other contracts now introducing. This has always been a cornerstone of NEC for the last 25 years. And this is a relatively simple process that requires the project manager or the contractor to notify the other as soon as either becomes aware of an issue that may affect time, cost, or quality. So it's all about proactive of risks at the earliest possible point. That risk is then shared. On the back of that, we have an early warning meeting, which are held at routine dates in accordance with the contract, and also by exception, when we get a really important or high impact early warning being notified. And in the early warning meeting, the parties cooperate. And the clause actually says they cooperate in looking at solutions, helping each other, trying to mitigate the effect, regardless of who's to blame, regardless of who's liable. That's not important right now. It could be a client risk, it could be a contractor's risk, but at this stage, who cares? It may affect time, cost, or quality. Somebody's going to have to pay a bill here, possibly. Someone may be responsible for delay. Let's try to mitigate the effects before it happens, or limit the effects if it's happening. And that way, whoever's responsible is going to benefit through that process. We also have value engineering clauses in the contract. There is one in a secondary option, X21, that encourages the contractor to put forward savings in whole life cost. So the cost of owning, operating, maintaining the asset once it's built. And also at clause 16 of the contract, we have the opportunity for the contractor to suggest savings in the cost of construction. And those savings, if if those ideas are taken forward and lead to savings, the savings are shared between the contractor and the client. So a way of encouraging the contractor to come up with good ideas, value engineering to deliver savings, as both parties will benefit and share in that. Final thing to touch on is compensation events. This, as I've said, is NEC terminology for variations and also what you may call contractors' claims under other contracts. And what we do in NEC is bring all entitlement to the contractor or the contractor may have in respect of getting additional time or money into a single section, section 6 of the contract, where we have a mechanical process for notifying, valuing, and implementing these compensation events. And this creates a single opportunity for the contractor to recover all the time and cost effects that flow from the event. And this has to happen within a fixed time scale so as to make sure we agree things as soon as they occur, if not before. It avoids the potential for retrospective claims and give both parties much greater certainty over what their financial position, their risks exposure will be. And then just maybe to show that in practice, I'll quickly go through this slide. Really, this slide is not to give you a detailed explanation of how compensation events work. It's really to show that we have this flow, that the contract contains a series of process flows that are designed to make sure that when we get a process, it has a start, it has an end, it identifies actions, who has to do what and by when, acting as, in effect, almost like a project execution plan, not just a contract. So this example is how the compensation event process works. Starts off with the project manager. The project manager can notify a compensation event. If they do, they will instruct the contractor to provide a quotation. If the contractor notifies a compensation event, so maybe the project manager failed to do so, the project manager has to decide whether they agree it is a compensation event or it is not. If they agree, they instruct a quotation. If they don't, the matter ends. The project manager has 1 week. That is all, 1 week in which to make that decision. That timescale can be extended by mutual consent, but we have a fixed timescale which we need to work to unless the parties agree to extend it. And there can be an 8-week time bar on the contractor notifying certain compensation events, requiring them to be proactive and not to submit claims or notifications of compensation events late. We also have a requirement for the project manager to respond to the notification. If they fail to do so, and the contractor submits a further notification, we can have a default acceptance of the contractor's notification of a compensation event due to the project manager's inaction, not for the project manager not doing what the contract requires them to do. When a quotation's instructed, there's options about dealing with risk, dealing with different ways of actually resolving or dealing with the problems. The contractor has 3 weeks in which to provide the quotation. Again, it can be extended by mutual consent, but we have a limited time frame. Project manager has 2 weeks to respond, either accept it, reject it, and ask the contractor to revise and resubmit, or the project manager can make their own assessments if there is a disagreement between the parties. The project manager has as long as the contractor did to make their assessment if they choose that option. And at the end, we have implementation where the time and cost effects are frozen. And we have what we call implementation of the event in terms of any changes to the prices, any changes to time. So just trying to show you, as I say, the flow, the process map within the clauses related to compensation events to get you from notification to implementation, identifying who has to do what and when, identifying timescales, and dealing with the consequences of failure, so that either the project manager or the contractor can drive a matter to a conclusion if the other party is not engaging or performing their functions. Okay, so I'll now sort of open the floor to questions. I think we've had a couple come through on the chat, but I'll hand over now to Sean to sort of take us through the Q&A session.
Okay. A big thank you to Pipeline and the NEC Contracts for holding this joint webinar today. My name is Sean Kennelly from Palm Commercial Services, and I work as an NEC consultant for Palm Services, and we're also using the NEC contracts on various oil and gas projects using the NEC. We also work on petrochemical projects, pharmaceutical, heavy and light rail, nuclear, civils and HS2, all of which are using the NEC successfully. I thank everyone for the questions raised. This is good to see a huge amount of interest in the webinar today. We probably haven't got enough time to respond to everything raised, but if there are any unanswered questions, we will endeavour to respond after. I'd also encourage you to have a look at the NEC Contracts website, which contains a lot of useful information on the NEC contracts. If you just go and have a look at a couple of the questions we've received. So over to you, Ian and Peter. So Stuart Sherlock was wondering if users need to be familiar with the NEC3 contracts prior to using the NEC4 contracts.
Okay, I would say no, in that NEC4 stands alone as a suite of contracts, as does NEC3. So you don't have to know NEC3 to know NEC4. You can just immediately start with NEC4. And we would actually recommend that. NEC4 is the latest version. It's, we think NEC3 improved. So we would recommend new users go straight to NEC4. If, though, you're familiar with NEC, if you know NEC3, you've used it, you're familiar with it, then the change to NEC4 will be quite simple, quite straightforward. NEC4 is really what we call an evolution of NEC3. It's NEC3 plus with certain improvements, simplifications, additional options. So it's, I say NEC4 is an enhanced or updated version of NEC3. You can go straight to that. But if you know NEC3, NEC4 is that, but hopefully improved. Peter, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that covers it extremely well. There is some, other than to say there is a guidance book to show the differences between NEC3 and NEC4 published by NEC.
So the question I think has come through from Donald Ballantyne about logic intended to be a model contract, however clients amend it. Does this happen sort of with the NEC? Well, there's always a risk that a client may take a model contract, a standard contract, and then choose to change it, revise it, amend it. We do allow there to be Z clauses. We do allow a client to amend the contract if they see fit. In fairness, it's pretty impossible to stop people doing that. Though we do try to give guidance on how to write the Z clauses. We give guidance on how you can deal with things without necessarily amending the contract through the main option selection, secondary option selection, use of the scope. So, if like we try to discourage unnecessary Z clauses, but ultimately that has got to be down to the client's prerogative.
Thank you for that, Ian. Another question from Paul Leonard from Deep Ocean, and he says, gents, I've heard that the administration of the NEC contracts can be difficult because of the notifications and time periods that need to be adhered to. Can you comment on this?
Okay, so
Ian, or
yeah, certainly, Peter, certainly.
Yeah, good management is always difficult, and good management processes are very important. So, in my experience, if you get the management right, then it's relatively easy. The people involved, of course. This contract doesn't make poor project managers good. Nobody can do that. But because it's a process-led contract, this enables you to use IT-based process systems, and there are several out there on the market specifically aimed at NEC to enable the headache of writing letters and that sort of thing, and communications can all be made within the cloud. So that is something that I strongly recommend, and NEC strongly recommend people look at if they want to go forward with using NEC contracts.
Thank you, Peter. Another question that we've had: how do you deal with changes in behaviours created by the contract?
Peter, do you want to take that one again?
No, let you have a go.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is a learning curve here, and we need to get away from the historic them and us type approach. Unfortunately, I think all of our histories has been, it's a bit of a game. Once it starts, the old jokes about the contractor's winning bid is the one who's made the biggest mistake. That from day one, it's how can we recover positions, take advantage of situations, try and get one over on the other side. We needed to really try and move away from that. That does not help get things built on time, on budget, deliver the quality. That just leads us to try to take advantage of each other's mistakes and problems. This contract is encouraging you to help each other, not to seek to take advantage, but to work, collaboratively. The contract, I think, helps the processes, the procedures, the need for transparency, openness, to notify things at the right time, producing programs, identifying early warnings. But yeah, there's still a cultural change, and it is a common theme. I mean, I've been sort of lucky or unlucky. I've been involved with introducing NEC into the UK, then into Hong Kong, and everyone in Hong Kong was saying, oh, we can't do this, we're adversarial, no one's going to operate it nicely, no one's going to play fair, everyone's going to take advantage. So why are we pretending? 10 years on, there's lots of people in Hong Kong saying, actually, this has really worked. This has been very beneficial. And actually, we have seen behaviours change. It is turning the oil tanker. It's often a slow process, but it's happened. Australia, working with Sydney Water, they're fairly recent adopters. Again, there's a little bit of cynicism. Well, will it work here? And we're not the type of industry that's used to partnering. People will seek advantage. But again, they're seeing benefits that actually, yeah, people aren't, taking advantage. They're trying to use it in the manner it's intended. People do things like try to introduce maybe partnering advisors, having workshops, trying to do behavioural assessments of bidders and trying to encourage the right behaviours. But ultimately, I think people, when they go to work and it's not a constant grind and a constant fight, but they're going to work and they get on with their colleague across the table from the contractor or client side, where they're actually helping and working with each other, they see the benefits in the actual reality of their lives being easier day to day.
Can I just add a little bit, just to say that this contract does not have a magic wand. No contract I know will ever stop people arguing if they want to, or make them argue if they don't want to. So it's not a magic wand.
Thank you for that. Another question with regards to mutual hold harmless provisions. So somebody's asked, how can these provisions be introduced, and is it too complicated for the contract?
Well, one thing's for sure, I'm sure of, and it's about the only thing I'm sure of, is that it isn't too complicated for the contract. But how to deal with it is part of the reason that we've set this thing up, and in many respects we're in listening mode. But just a few things just to point out. First of all, any of you responsible or who are familiar with the 3rd edition of the NEC, if you look at the 4th edition, you'll see that section 8, which deals with risks and liabilities, has been considerably amended. I hold my hand up as being the person that led that amendment. What we do have, and what we've always had, is the ability. We try to make sure that liability and risks are clearly allocated between the parties, and that there are no cracks they can fall down between. One, it's these are yours, and the rest are yours. Secondly, we've got joint name insurances. We always have had for damage and such like, and we also have waiver of subrogation rights on those joint names. Finally, option X18, which Ian has touched on, limits the contractor's liability, financial liability, for those risks that they carry, and for various obligations. And there are 3 or 4 different options you can choose for different things. You can choose them all, or you can just cherry pick them, 1 or 2. And it also includes time limits for contractual obligations to end, which is very useful in jurisdictions that don't have a statutory scheme. Unlike the UK, they have a statutory scheme, or it may be that the statutory scheme is too long, and you want to limit it to shorter periods. So we've got that sort of framework to start with, and we've got the ability to change a lot of this within the contract. We've got the ability to add additional risks onto the employer's side, or change who does the insurances and that sort of thing. Much too complex to talk about in a session like this, but well worth looking and thinking about in the future. And that's, if you like, one of the reasons this is the first step that we're trying to take to understand what the industry wants and try to provide it.
Yeah, if I could just maybe add to that, yeah, I think the starting point in the NEC, in all of the contracts apart from the Alliance, is risk or liability is allocated to one party or the other. They are not sort of shared liabilities. So if you want an approach of having liabilities that are sort of shared, or each party bears their own element of it, that may need some tweaks to the standard contracts. However, in the Alliance contract, where we have a single set of terms and conditions, multiple suppliers, contractors, consultants, the liabilities there are shared amongst all members of that, sort of each taking an element of responsibility through the sharing of underspend or overspend financial performance. So yeah, if we're going to have liabilities that are borne by more than one party, that may need some tweaks to the standard contract, but it's not a massive amount of changes. We do already have a net contribution clause in there. We do have, as Peter said, joint names insurances. So there may be some tweaks needed around that, but I don't think it would be something that is, well, certainly not impossible to do. And there has been examples of that happening.
Okay, thank you, Ian and Peter. One final question, if that's okay. Can you take away the time bar facility for compensation events, and can you amend the compensation event timescales?
Simple answer is yes, in that you can. It'd have to be via a Z clause. There is no option for that within the standard contract. We think the timescales are pretty sensible and reasonable. In fairness, the contract does allow the parties to mutually agree to change or extend these. Certainly in terms of responses to notifications. And so that could be used, and the parties could agree to extend the timescales as long as they do so before the response is required and both parties agree to it. However, a client could, through Z clauses, actually amend them in the standard contract, either remove the time bar of 8 weeks or extend it, or possibly extend the periods for reply to various communications. I think all we would caution on that is you need to think carefully about why you're doing it and what the benefit you believe you will get is. Because just because you extend the timescale, often having 6 months compared to 6 weeks won't make a difference. It's just a difficult answer, but somebody has to provide an answer. Somebody has to make a decision. So often extending timescales because people can't make a decision does not then help them make a decision. It just means they take longer to decide, and provide that response. So you've got to think carefully about what you're trying to achieve by extending or changing the timescales.
Yeah, just to add a bit, why would you want to change them? In many respects, you have to think very carefully, and often occasionally we see clients wanting changes that are very one-sided in their benefit, and you'll then see contractors doing exactly the same. A balance needs to be drawn between the two parties' responsibilities in that case. So it's something I wouldn't recommend without careful thought.
Thank you for that, Peter, and thank you, Ian. We do have a few other questions, but I don't think we'll be able to fit them in during this time frame available. But we'll endeavour to respond to each of the individuals who have answered a question and haven't been able to get an answer. So again, thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm sure Ian and Peter will also give their thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for attending. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to the Pipeline Industries Guild for the opportunity to present. And thank you, Sean, for hosting this Q&A session.
Yep.
Wish everyone a good afternoon.
Yep. Good afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.